Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions, and we apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Our fascination with lost gardens is more than a mere pervasive wistfulness for the past or a vague longing for a vanished paradise. It is often fueled by our interest in reconstructing worlds that supply us with a powerful means of making sense of the past and a way of reading history. Today's lecture, a companion to the 2024 exhibition of the same name at London's Garden Museum, will celebrate the metropolis's vast and varied garden legacy, from humble allotments and defunct squares to amateur botanical gardens, princely pleasure grounds, artist gardens, and private menageries. Some of these gardens have vanished or have changed beyond recognition, but all have contributed to over the centuries, to the quality of life and well-being of generations of Londoners. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. We could not mount these webinars without the support of donors like the Cornell Foundation and you. Todd Longstaffe-Gowan is a noted historian and landscape architect. He serves as Gardens Advisor to Historic Royal Palaces, President, the London Gardens Trust, lecturer at New York University in London, and editor of the London Gardener. Todd is also the author of several books, including The London Square, English Garden Eccentrics, and Lost Gardens of London, which was published in 2024. Please join me in welcoming Todd.
Thank you very much. Welcome from London, and thanks for the very kind introduction. As Curtis said, I've had a long fascination with gardens, especially around the metropolis, because it's had such a varied legacy over such a very long time, almost 1,000 years of gardens, many of which have been destroyed, but tantalizing fragments survive that tell us quite a lot about what was there in the past. So this afternoon, I wish to give you a little soupçon of some of these places that have amused me and have special meaning to me. So I'd like to start with my first image of from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations in 1866. It's a later drawing from the 20th century by this fellow called Ardizoni, who's an English artist. And it shows Mr. Wemmick's house. And Wemmick was the protagonist, among the protagonists in Great Expectations. And he invites Mr. or Pip to his home in South London. And he explains that, there's not much to show, he says, but 2 or 3 curiosities that he's a bit fond of, including his garden, his summer house. So they go down these ditches and back lanes in South London until they find this place of rather dull retirement on the side of the road. And he says, this is my little cottage, my garden. And it looks like a mock castle, as you can see here in the view. And there's a real flagstaff, a real flag, a drawbridge, and a plank crossing what he called a chasm about 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, as well as a cannon on a latticework carriage that was fired daily at an appointed hour. So he says, he walks them around the garden. He shows Pip this wonderful place, his little castle, as we know, the expression, every Englishman's home is his castle. He shows them around and he says, this is a wonderful place. And he introduces them to his father, who is known as the aged parent, who touchingly pronounces, this is a very fine place for my son, sir. This is a pretty pleasure ground. This spot and these beautiful works upon it ought to be kept together for the nation, after my son's time, for the people's enjoyment. Well, we all know that such a place was very ephemeral and would soon disappear, and that this idea that his garden should save posterity was a rather curious wish, especially in a metropolitan context where almost everything was destroyed in a very short time after it was made. But it shows what's so interesting about gardens to me is that it's their ephemeral quality that makes them so alluring, so wonderful to study. So I'm going to now start my little survey, having sort of made this poignant introduction, with some gardens in Strand. Here we are in the centre of London in the 17th century, this map from 1666. And it shows on the bottom right the river with some of the palatial gardens that line the Thames that were formed from the Middle Ages onwards. Strand was a small street, as the name implies. It was a tiny street that connected Westminster in the west to the City of London in the east. And originally it was very close to the Thames foreshore. And these great palaces were showed up in this Strand from very early days. For the most part, they were episcopal palaces or belonged to the church, major players in the church. And all of them had gardens. These became secular residencies from the 16th century onwards until many of them were destroyed in the 19th century. But you can see in this image some of these gardens. And the one I want to focus on now is this one here, which is called Suffolk House, but later becomes Northumberland House. And this could have been seen in Trafalgar Square, well, we now know Trafalgar Square was formed in the early 17th century. It was one of the last great houses to be raised in Strand and one of the last to be also demolished. Here we see this four-square building like the Tower of London rising above this frothy garden as on the edge of the Thames. And it was said at the time that as you approached London by river, as you always did, you would have seen these great palaces in their garden descending to the side of the river because there was a slope leading down to the river. So there were these wonderful series of things that welcomed tourists of the grandest sort as they approached London by water. In the next image, we can see the plan from the early 17th century. There was on the left-hand side a central court, and then a series of regular beds within the walled enclosure facing the south and the river. And at the bottom, there was access to the river itself with a water gate. And we can see this in subsequent views. This is the house itself in a photograph from the late 19th century, a great Jacobean pile, as I said, that would have been visible had you been standing now at the center of Trafalgar Square. You can see the lion of the family facing its house in Sion in the west of the city. So the next image shows the gardens in the 19th century, which were never terribly special. They'd lost most of their interest by this time. The family spent less time here and they became much more dull, as it were, and grassed over, but still an important pleasure ground at the very heart of the metropolis. And they was destroyed from 1876 when the house was demolished to make way for the new embankment laid out by Bazalgette. This was the idea of laying out the underground as well as the new sewers along the side of the Thames and the river. And here we see spectators arriving to watch the spectacle of the house being demolished and the garden being exposed for the first time. And people were invited in, and this would be your average Londoner, were invited in by tickets to actually see the house in the process of demolition or just before demolition, so they could actually see one of these great houses shortly before it was destroyed. And the next image shows what happens soon after you get this building being leveled. You can see from this sort of slightly aerial prospect in the back middle ground towards the left, there's this little silver thread of the River Thames. So it was the first time in almost 3 centuries that you could see the Thames from Strand. So this made a considerable difference. And very sadly, though, this land was then demolished, this building was demolished and was built over. We can see in the next slide the garden as it looked, looking towards the National Gallery on the opposite side, built in the 1820s. So you can see this vacant piece of land. And it was said at the time, it was much lamented that this very important and large garden in central London should be given up for making a new road. On the opposite side of Strand, further down, we have Bedford House. And this was one of the grander houses on the north side of Strand. It had no access to the water, but it had an enormous estate of roughly 29 acres called the largest great field. On the site, you can see on the top left, piazza of Covent Garden. For those who've been to London, you'll know it's one of the great open spaces from the 17th century and the first square to be opened and made in London. So their house was built at the bottom in Strand itself and led through a series of gardens that would take you up and give you panoramas over the piazza, because they developed their estate with rows of houses so to maximize the profit on their land. This is an early 18th century plan that shows the relationship of the garden, which you can see with its geometrical patterns, to Strand in the bottom and to Covent Garden on the top. So it gives you this idea how it was sandwiched and pushed back amongst all this development. But there were wonderful views across the gardens, as we can see in the next image. This is a painting from the mid-17th century, and you can see the central piazza in southern Covent Garden with St. Paul's in the western edge and the piazza houses, as they call them, on the right. And on the left-hand side, we have the little alcoves that projected from, in this detail, you can see them from the garden wall, so that one would gain panoramas over the square itself. They were so pleased with their new development that they actually wanted to show it off. Now, they soon got tired of this place because it got too built up. So in 1704, the family then sold their place. Well, they didn't sell it, but they redeveloped their house, gave up their garden, and laid out streets of houses and moved to the further up north in their estate. All the land coloured in yellow on this plan is part of the Bedford estate, the lower bit in Covent Garden and the top bit in Bloomsbury. The area that you can see on the top right-hand side that looks like a green funnel was their new garden for Bedford House. And this is a close-up. You can see the garden that extended and gave this great vistas to the countryside. It was always very important for the greatest landowners who lived in London that they had some sort of connection with their great houses and the countryside. So very often had this idea of funneling as much greenery into town as possible. For those who know London again, you can see that little oval, which was among the earliest oval gardens in after that's Bedford Square. And then a garden and a house immediately to the left of Bedford House, right in the center of the slide, is Montague House, which I'll also discuss in a moment. This shows the two houses together. On the right, we have Bedford House, and on the left, we have Montague House, both being roughly contemporary and both being terribly grand, except that the house on the right, Bedford House, had a much more extensive garden than its neighbor. This shows the front view to Bedford House. It was built in Bloomsbury Square, then known as King's Square, and it was a large open space with rails around it. And you can see that either side of the house has sort of cheeks, as it were, of plantations of trees to frame this great pile on the north side of the square. Like so many early squares, the landowner had a presence on the square itself, so he could enjoy this place and views over the central area, which was laid out in a very simple open space, because squares were initially designed to supply light and ventilation rather than having elaborate gardens. These only developed from the late 18th century. But you can see how grand this was in this composition. This is a close-up, which was an engraving produced after the house had been demolished, but it shows how smart the house was and how it had its own forecourt as well. But the back was a little bit more rustic. This shows you some of the views looking from the back part of the garden. You can see Montague House on the right and the Tower of St. George's, Bloomsbury, and you can't quite make out the garden of the house itself, but it was a rather smart place as well. This shows Montague House, the neighbouring house, as I mentioned, further to the west, from what we now know as Tottenham Court Road. And you can see this is a drawing from the late 1600s, produced by a Frenchman visiting the capital. And you can see how the house lords over its setting and how this great line of trees marches into the countryside. And this close-up in the next image supplies with a better view of the garden, as they say, le jardin, of this wonderful urban pile. This is Montague House from Great Russell Street, which was the front. It had the appearance of a great French chateau, or like a hôtel particulier, as they called them in Paris. So a grand townhouse with its enormous walls screening the garden from the public and the curious, and with a great portal leading into the forecourt of this magnificent palace. But you can see further in the distance, it's hard in this particular slide, but there's the garden at the front and the forecourt of Bedford House just down the road. So it was a house, or pardon me, a road filled with magnificent palaces. This is the back garden for Montague House. It was laid out in the style of the French gardens of the period because the first Duke of Montague had spent time as the ambassador extraordinary in Paris and had come back with great pretensions and a lot of money and was able to build a very substantial French-inspired garden behind his house. And it had fountains and statuary based on the antique series of terraces and had wonderful views over the open countryside behind it. The next image shows the remains on the bottom right-hand side of part of the garden after it had been redeveloped in the early 19th century, because what had happened was that the Duke after the Duke's death, the house went sort of to sleep, and in its slumber started to decay, and it was eventually sold in the 1760s to the British Museum, and it's now the site of the British Museum. And this was the Egyptian gallery on the bottom here as it was first created. And they started laying these out piecemeal within the gardens in a very English way. They didn't demolish the whole house. It came down in pieces. And you can see how the garden was gradually carved away. So that thing that looks like a beached whale in the bottom right is in fact the remains of the formal gardens from the 17th century. This is the back of the garden from Montague House, and you can see how it abutted the open countryside. This painting was painted during 1780, when the Gordon riots, these great anti-Catholic riots, were taking place in London, and lots of destruction was taking place, so that the armed forces were invited in to colonize some of the gardens and the squares in London with a view to maintaining the peace. And here we can see the temporary encampment was set up in the gardens behind the house itself. And you can see the various tents. But again, a very similar arrangement with this little projecting apse over the countryside. These were conceived so you got a panoramic view, a sort of semicircular view across countryside. So it implied that there were great views to be got from the garden. Now we're jumping ahead a little bit to the early 19th century. This is 1844. And this was a view that was produced showing some of these dandies and their wives in the gardens at the Royal Surrey Zoological Garden. It was called at the time a complete work of art because it was such an extraordinary place. It was a place of healthful amusement for the promotion of zoology as well as botany for everyone who lived close to the metropolis. And it was created by this man who'd earlier had an emporium called the Exchange, which had the largest display of exotic and unusual animals, within central London. And due to a change in taste, he decided to move further out into the country. So he went south of the river, bought some land there, and he started creating this wonderful garden. And this is it in 1844. And you can see what's so interesting here for us is the fact that it was not just a garden. He had, as it were, a number of buildings as well that were also laid out for the display of plants. So it was this idea of taking, and it was a zoological garden as well. So unlike the Zoological Garden of London, which had been created from around the 1820s onwards, where they had strictly the display of animals, here Cross decided that he would actually also combine that with an interest in plants. So he actually had plants labeled in both their Latin and their English names so that people that wandered around the garden could enjoy and learn about plants as well. What's interesting here too is that this great basin, when he bought this property, it had this large reflecting pool, which he used to great advantage. There was, this became, as it were, a mirror for the entertainments that took place here. And this one I'll go into in just a moment that you see here in the background with this papier-mâché elephant and sort of gimcrack Indian scenery was created in the 1850s of 1840s, pardon. It was this idea of recreating these sonnes lumières within the garden. It was this idea of having temporary spectacles that made this garden so extraordinary and so unusual in London. The next image shows one of these great craggy excrescences that was built in the garden. And this was actually recycled from a garden that was built in central London, just off the Oxford Street in the late 18th century. The rock came from the Rock of Gibraltar and was brought here and reassembled to make this wonderful construction. And we can have a look at the next image. This is was the source of this material. This was a vivarium, or a sort of a special display case for wild animals that were chained to this particular place. And you can see a number of curious and exotic birds, strange things like ichthyosauruses, and a miniature Matterhorn on the top, and as well as a little grotto and memento mori on the right, with some tourists looking agog at this construction. Well, this was made by this man in the 1770s, who was a medical doctor, for the display of strange beasts. And in the 1830s, he sold it up. We tried to sell it up and was unsuccessful. He gave it to the Surrey Zoological Gardens. So next image, please. Here we can see one of the other little rockeries that was made in the gardens, and this was a tortoise enclosure. It was among the first tortoise enclosures created in London, and you can see two of these little beasts wandering around their garden. We know from contemporary accounts in the press that they were very greedy. This is one of the grandest of the many extravaganzas that were made in the gardens. This shows, as it were, the Temple of Allure, which was one of the great sites of India that was well known at the time. But most people in London, of course, had never traveled, were completely unacquainted with India. So the prospect of seeing this artificial scenery recreated in a part of London, in South London, seemed a most amazing spectacle. So they would come in great numbers to this subscription garden. This garden, as I mentioned, was created with a view to bringing people for temporary entertainments and to teach them about botany and zoology. But it was, as I said, it was this idea of creating temporary displays that made it so special. And you can see on the left-hand side, as I mentioned earlier, one of the papier-mâché elephants. All these structures were made out of, were just made out of straw, canvas, timber, all lashed together, and didn't have to last terribly long, and were made entirely for scenic effect. No one could get terribly close to these places because they were closed off the gate, and they were often miniaturized as well and kept at a distance, more or less as we might do now, or we would see in stage scenery or at within films. This shows another spectacle that was made. This is the taking of the Rock of Gibraltar. There were many spectacles that took place in the gardens I mentioned. This was one of them. There was also Napoleon crossing the Alps. There was a Great Fire of London, as well as the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction as you can see here, the destruction of the surrounding countryside. And this is great because this shows an image made at the time, showing what the scenery looked like. But what's even more fascinating is that there is also a view that shows it that was sold to the punters who came to see the gardens in the next image. And you can see what they did is they made these things called transparencies. And transparencies were great colored graphic images, sort of like a large placemat. And they were made to be placed on windows, so they were backlit. And this showed the spectacle taking place within the gardens. So what happens was that on a regular basis, they would have these eruptions of the volcano. Cannons would fire, lights would go off, fires be lit. There was terrible racket created, as well as lots of other scenic effects. And this would then be reflected, as we can see here, on the water to create this enormously picturesque effect, and made the gardens, until the 1850s at least, before they were closed down, among the most remarkable places to visit in South London. But you can imagine how people who had never been abroad would have been utterly transported by these amazing spectacles. This is another place on the site of Earl's Court, and there are any number of curious villas that were built in and around London, but this is among the more unusual ones. This was created by Dr. Hunter, who was an eminent doctor and surgeon at the time. He was an eminent anatomist as well. And this was his garden as seen from the front, which you can just make out if you look through the railings on either side of the gate, is that there are large shells of giant clams with eagles chained to them. As you saw almost in the last slide I showed of the vivarium, in Oxford Street, they were friends. So they were both doctors, both anatomists, both boiled up the bones of their decayed beasts and displayed them within their gardens for a picturesque display. You can also see two lions mounted on the parapet of the extensions to the house. And this shows his back garden, which was again very unique. It had a series of little eye catchers, and you can see also here some wonderful wild beasts. And we know from contemporary displays that he had things like zebus, I think there was even a giraffe, a lion as well. And this shows a close-up of the front of the garden. Soon after we changed, there's a little basin and some birds chained to it, and there was in fact a little pool with skulls of monkeys and other things around it. You can see these obelisks and some of the beasts I mentioned, as well as over the door, there's a gharial or a Ganges crocodile sitting on top of the portico. And this is the lion's den, which is among the more unusual buildings in the garden. This was created at one extreme end of the garden, and atop this little place was mounted a little fortress from which you would fire cannon shots, well, warning shots to trespassers in an attempt to keep the curious from invading his garden. And this is one of the largest and grandest gardens that was built in London in the mid-19th century, or late 19th century. It was the Garden of the Royal Botanic Gardens. They had for the Royal Horticultural Society. The Royal Horticultural Society had been established in around 1804, and among their the initial ideas for when they set up this particular society was that they should have a display garden to experiment with plants and to show them to members, so they'd become acquainted with plants and be encouraged to do wonderful horticultural tricks. So they had first a small garden in Chiswick, which just about collapsed and made them bankrupt. And then after a fallow period, they were convinced to try their luck again at creating a great garden. And this they did, and they did so with the help of the Prince Consort, Queen Victoria's husband, and they carried out this rather enormous garden on site of the former exhibition ground from 1861. So at the top of the slide, for those who know London, would be now the site of the Royal Albert Hall. But you can see this great garden that was compared at the time to Versailles, unfolding on the side of this land facing south. Next image, please. This is the excavation that took place to build the garden. They dug deeply into the ground to build this wonderful, this extraordinary garden, which was inspired in parts by the Albani Palace in Rome, with its great colonnades, and by Versailles and its series of very elaborate beds that went through it. And this shows a colored photograph from the late 19th century, when you can see how this Arcadian garden was looking at its absolute best, with this enormous greenhouse and the dome, as it were, the rotunda of the Albert Hall in the distance. And it was shortly after this great moment that the gardens were actually destroyed, because what happened was the RHS, as it was known, refused to let non-members visit the garden. So again, they had financial problems and were forced to sell up and destroy the garden. So it was a sad loss for this part of London. I have a particular interest in mounts, which are large artificial sort of swellings that were created in gardens across the metropolis for at least 1,000 years. This one is in suburban London. This is the former gate, water gate to Hampton Court Palace, from a drawing of the mid-16th century. Behind, you can see sort of an ogive dome at the center middle of the slide. Just to the left, lower left of there, you can see a series of upright sort of posts surmounted by little things. These are beasts, or royal beasts from the royal menagerie. And this, as it were, marked the sinuous walk that went up, as the winding walk, as they called it, that led to the top of the mount upon which was erected a banqueting house for Henry VIII. And this was a very typical thing, where you'd actually erect these small swellings with a view to creating panoramic places to absorb and to view and to enjoy the countryside around it. Hampton Court being very flat, You just had to get up only about several feet, about 20 feet, to get these incredible panoramas across the open countryside. This was a great inspiration for many gardens. This is a small, almost contemporary garden that was created in East London, so they were quite ubiquitous across the metropolis. This one here shows the typical relationship between how these mounts were created, often between the mansion and some water. On the left-hand side, that hatched part of that long thing is a canal. So you would enter this thing that looks a bit like a Christmas pudding. You go through this wilderness garden first and enter the mount itself, which was hollowed out, and ascend some stairs. And like a mole, you would come to the top of the garden into a little summer house or pavilion, and from there you get panoramas over the open countryside. This was a design from the 1730s by our friend Bridgman, who worked at Kensington Palace, one of the great gardeners who helped lay out the royal gardens. He'd initially thought that there might be a pair of these mounts at either side of the gardens, so you could get great views over the gardens, but in fact it was reduced to one. We can see in the next image. One of these mounts, this was among the earlier ones that preceded it. On the top left-hand side was a small mount that was created in the new gardens laid out around 1710 in the former quarry gardens, or quarries that were used to mine gravel for the streets of London. They were turned into a small garden by one of the greatest designers of the period, and it was much celebrated in especially this one particular compartment where you had a mount again overlooking the gardens. Next image, please. And this was the most celebrated of all, this wonderful giant pimple that was just off the sort of towards the east end of the Kensington Gardens, was erected in around in the 1730s, and it was surmounted, planted entirely around the base. You can see here was a winding serpentine path that went round it, and atop it was a lovely little eye-catching temple designed by the architect and scenographer William Kent. And this building was was able to rotate, so you could avoid the wind and catch the sunshine as well. This was destroyed in the early 19th century. And this was done by the same man. This is a little garden that was created in Richmond. And here you had, as it were, a small hermitage at the bottom, atop of which they built a little mount as well. So you had this idea you could actually penetrate the mount itself, where you'd see waxworks of some of the monarchs and other sort of contemporary scenes. And then on top, you could actually rise and get this wonderful view as well. This taste for mounts percolated right the way down into the most humble houses. You've got them in small terrace gardens across the metropolis. And here we can see some of these things in a small garden that later became a schoolyard. On the top right-hand side, you get these winding paths with tiny mounts, a rather extraordinary composition in this part of Kensington, not far from Kensington Palace. So you can see how the taste disseminated very easily from the royal gardens into these suburban gardens. There were all these people looking for ideas, and the royal gardens were a great source of inspiration. This is my favorite and most infamous mount that was created. It was a great pile of cinders, and it was created in the probably in the early 18th century, Smith's dust heap, and it was a remarkable place insofar it was formed of mostly just rubbish that had been piled up over the centuries. It was called in the early 19th century, Sublime Sifted Wonder of Cockney, and it was, as I mentioned, this great mountain of cinders and dirt that had been piled up. I think it could be seen as a landscape feature because it can be perceived as a great mountain in town. And you can see it has, like you have in most mounts that were in decorative gardens, it has winding paths. And it could be equated with something that we find in Our Mutual Friend by Dickens, when he talks about, as it were, this garden that was created by Mr. Harman in Mr. Harman's dust heap when he grew rich and he gave his garden to his friend Mr. Noddy Boffin. Mr. Boffin later turns this sort of wonderful geological formation formed out of dust and coal dust and vegetable rubbish into something rather extraordinary. He creates this kind of a wonderful garden. And he talks about, Dickens talks about how it has these picturesque qualities. And he puts an arbor and he makes a little garden around it. And he treats it more or less like a great landscape feature. And very nicely, he says how from the place he and his wife, Mrs. Boffin, could gaze over her late father's canine provision trade as well. So just like any aristocrat would view wonderful spectacles and wonderful eye-catching features from the top of his mount, Mr. Boffin too had these great views over less important but equally interesting points of view. Now we know that this is something landscape like a landscape feature because at least one artist did several views, and here we see it in winter. So it really did have this enormous landscape quality that really did add to the surroundings. To give you some idea where it was, for those who know London again, if you were standing on the south side of King's Cross Station, you'd be looking right into this dust heap, and it did present quite a spectacle. It was destroyed, sadly. It was one of, I should say, many dust heaps across London, but this was the most significant. It was destroyed in the early 19th century, and it was said, possibly apocryphally, that the spoil was taken away to St. Petersburg, where it was used to make bricks to rebuild some of these Russian cities after the Napoleonic Wars. And this is the most ridiculous of all the mounts. This was this great artificial swelling that was created in Oxford Street, in Marble Arch, at the western end of Oxford Street. And it was much derided for very obvious reasons. First, it cost £7.5 million to make. And secondly, it was the most ineffectual, most appallingly, shabbily made sort of mount you could possibly imagine. So it was compared to all these terrible sort of fake Parnassuses or of this mighty Olympus in the center of London. But in fact, it was everything other than that. It was a complete flop. So the serpentine path was turned into a series of sort of metal steps that went up. The mount itself was created out of scaffolding covered in sort of grass that was almost always dead. The plants that were put up on the side, you can see here, failed miserably. So visitors were invited to rise above London and the Marble Arch on the right-hand side to get these great views. But of course, when they got there, they realized that the trees were so high you couldn't see into Hyde Park. And then afterwards, you have to descend into a shopping experience before you were spit out at the bottom. So all in all, it was a terrible waste of money and a great disaster, as it were, for Westminster City Council. It shows how this interest in mounts has persisted even to the present. This is the Peerless Pool, or also known as the Perilous Pool, on account of the fact that many young swimmers, who weren't really very adequate swimmers, drown in this pool. It was the first outdoor swimming pool created in London, and it was created in around the early 1770s, and it became a very fashionable resort, which lasted until the mid-19th century. But it really was among the first places to make a place available for Londoners who had interest in bathing more than swimming, and coming out and enjoying the open air and the benefit of having a place to, as I said, enjoy something different from all the other pleasures of Metropolis. It was later developed to have a series of hot and cold baths and fishing ponds, but this shows that at its sort of height in the early 19th century, you can see people both fishing and swimming within this basin. Most of us, I'm sure, seldom pondered whether brothels had gardens, but apparently they did. This is a rather spectacular one. It is documented in 1632, and this was called Holland's Liga. It was built on the south side of the Thames, very close to what we now know as Tower Bridge, and it was a rather amazing little island resort that was open to those who were willing to pay to come and enjoy the wonderful pleasures of this, what they call a stew or a brothel. And you can see this inscription on the top left-hand side, which is translated as Virgilian, and it just implies that night and day the gates to gloomy hell are open all the time. And what's really wonderful about this little island is it was concealed in the south foreshore of the River Thames, and you can see the sort of zigzag pattern that indicates the water. So one had to cross a little drawbridge, and you can see there's a guard with a pike, and you can see Elizabeth Holland, as it were, in the window, the madam welcoming, beckoning visitors. So you had to cross the drawbridge, were let in, and you can see no less than two assignations taking place in the garden, one in the bower and one in the gardens and little parterre itself. And most wonderfully, there's a little boat on the right-hand side, so one had to make a speedy escape, as many of these visitors were very grand, and especially foreign ambassadors were said to have visited this place with great frequency, would have to disappear rather quickly. It should be said too, which is really interesting, that the only reason we have this image at all is that in the early 1630s, there was an attempt to clean up these resorts of ill repute on the south side of the river, which had been full of these places since at least the Middle Ages. And Henry VIII had tried to suppress them, but been very unsuccessful. But there was a concerted campaign to destroy this place and to close it, as it were, in the 1630s, and unsuccessfully. Two plays and various poems were written celebrating the place, and I think her place remained open. So Donna, as you can see here, Donna Britannica Hollandia, the archmistress of the wicked women of Utopia, was kept in business by the fact that most people found her place rather charming. I'm going to conclude with this a series of gardens, only going to discuss one in particular, but I just want to say how the incursion of railways in London caused great mayhem and led to the destruction of lots of gardens. I call this the sort of the Bermuda Triangle of gardens in London. At the center of the image is Euston Station. For those who are not acquainted with London, it's one of London's many stations on the north side of the city. And this led, as it were, out into the open countryside. So many gardens were created in and around this area before the railway station arrived. On the bottom two, you can just make out the figures 4 and 5. Those were two squares that were laid out in the early 19th century on the Bedford estate, Ensley Gardens, and now Euston Square. And they were created on this great spine of a new road, the Euston Road, that was welcoming people into London. And these gardens were destroyed with the advent of the railway. They made a forecourt and built the Euston Arch, and later destroyed that as well to create a bigger station. And on the left-hand side is the station. Immediately to the left is the gardens of a burial ground, which I'll discuss in just one moment. And above the station, the crescent-shaped garden is Ampthill Square, and the top one is Mornington Square, both of which were built over by buildings in the 1930s. But we're going to just have a quick look at this one particular one here, this St. James's Chapel, which was formed in the late 18th century with a very beautiful building by Wyatt. It was on the perimeter of town at the time. You can see the cattle being driven into town, into market. And the church itself had a little garden in front, as well the chapel, as well as a very handsome burial ground at the back. The next plan shows the garden in the mid-19th century, before the encroachment had started to take place. What happened, as so often takes place, is the station got larger and larger, more and more popular, and expanded to the west, not to the east. So where it says Whittlebury Street, this was destroyed, and part of the burial ground was chewed up. And over the succeeding years, the ground gradually disappeared, the last bit of which only disappeared within the recent past. Here we can see on the right-hand side of the image the remains of the garden, which was destroyed only within the last 10 years for the expansion of the HS2, the high-speed 2 link that's supposed to, it's still a project which never seems to want to be finished or completed or even talked about, but the extension of the railway up into the northern counties of England. But they destroyed the last vestige of this garden, and it was really very sad to see the whole place disappear. But it shows how that gardens are lost even now, even though we have a much greater interest in preserving these spaces for the future, that they are still endangered by development, especially when you're dealing in the context of a large metropolis. And the next image is my concluding one, which shows the cover of my book and the image I showed you earlier of the spectacle taking place at the gardens in the Royal Surrey Zoological Gardens. But I think that, if anything, I learned in this particular exercise of mounting this exhibition, writing the book, was the fact that first, that London, not surprisingly, has a extraordinary legacy of really remarkably diverse and wonderfully eccentric and idiosyncratic gardens that happen everywhere in the metropolis, and that many of these fragments survive, and that these little tidbits that survive can be very evocative and very wonderful. And one can, in a way, sort of recreate or imagine what was there in the past. And I think also what's really important is that one realizes when you see how many great and distinctive places have disappeared, how important it is that we value all of these garden spaces for the contribution they make to the welfare of all the inhabitants of the metropolis and visitors as well, because these are the things that make London so wonderful. And it's gardens, I think, that make London, as it were, one of the most unusual major metropolises in the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Todd, for that wonderful presentation, especially those last words, which I thought were inspirational. I will say that for those of you interested in Todd's book, which I highly recommend, you will be receiving in the follow-up email a link where you can purchase it. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I'd like to mention. On September 23rd, our American Inspiration Series will feature Molly Beer talking about her new book, Angelica, For Love and Country in a Time of Revolution. On October 3rd, I'll be hosting Becky Burton, who will be talking about Jane Austen, J.M.W. Turner, and Harwood House in Yorkshire. And then finally, on October 17th, I will be hosting our old friend, Christopher Ridgway, who will be talking about Castle Howard in the 21st century, its rebirth. We also have 3 2026 heritage tours that I'd like to highlight. In May, we'll be touring our wonderful home city of Boston. In September, we'll be seeing the best country houses in Ireland. And in December, we'll have a magical London Christmas tour. You can find out more information about all these events at americanancestors.org/events. Now let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we will answer as many as we can in the time that we have. And I'm going to start off, Todd, with my question, which is, does St. James's Church still stand? We know the garden is gone. Is the church still there?
No, sadly, the church was destroyed quite a while ago, so that didn't help insofar as that the major feature of the garden had been destroyed in the 19th century. So no, sadly, that's gone. But there were, quite a number of important trees, and uh, also it was there was also a garden next door to it, or very close to it, called Euston Square, and it really remained pretty intact from its 19th century design until recently, when they chopped all the trees down, removed the railings to make a taxi rank as well as a bike park. So very sad. And people actually protested very vigorously against that and chained themselves to the trees and did what they call yarn bombing, which means that you knit sort of bands and you wrap them around the trees and try and protect them. Sadly, even the vicar of Camden did this, but they still chopped the trees down, much to everyone's chagrin.
That is horrible. Speaking of things that are demolished, can we assume that the mount next to Marble Arch has been demolished?
Yes, happily.
I
It was
thought
always
you'd say
intended to be
that.
a temporary construction, but yes, it was a very tragic day, of course, when it was demolished. No, it was so much lambasted in the press that it was a great disgrace to Westminster and a terrible waste of public money. So it collapsed very readily. And in fact, they did say, though, like so many gardens, I didn't mention, though, when Northumberland House, one of the first and the earliest houses I discussed, was demolished in the 19th century, the gardens were stripped of their plants and their soil, and that was reused actually to create the embankment gardens. And just as that happened earlier on, this happened with the demolition of the Mount. Most of the grass was dead, but the shrubs that were alive, just alive, were transported into one of the neighbouring council estates, and they were planted there, and hopefully are thriving now in much better conditions.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Um, Karen asks, are there any gardens left from Whitehall Palace?
Sadly not. Well, we have the one. No gardens per se. There is of course the banqueting house, but everything else was built over. So that part of town was just so heavily rebuilt uh, so many times that there's really not much open space left. There are a few remains of earlier bits that survive, like the York Steps and the York House Watergate, but those were almost all reconstructed.
It's important to say here as an aside that Whitehall Palace at its height was one of the largest palaces in Europe. I mean, just an enormous maze of buildings. And we're very lucky actually just to still have the banqueting house left.
Yes,
Um,
it was, and then it was saved because the king ordered that they should demolish all the buildings in the palace beside it so that they could save the gem, as it were, the most
mm,
important part of the whole palace. The rest of the palace, as you know, rambled for miles and was bisected by Whitehall. But it was, as you say, a very important place that burnt down in the late 17th century.
and for those of you interested, the banqueting house is run by Historic Royal Palaces, which Todd is associated with and is open to the public and is one of the most important spaces, I think, in London. And also, it's from the windows of this palace that Charles I walked to his execution. How did William Kent's temple rotate?
I think it was on casters and it was on a great sort of stone base, so you could actually spin it. And it was actually quite common. This one's recorded, but we know that were similar arrangements in some of the small squares. There was one, for instance, in Portman Square, where I think the Turkish ambassador in the early 19th century had a similar arrangement where he had this little tent that was erected that could be spun and moved around, as it were, so that he could get glimpses of the sun. So it was a very sort of fashionable conceit.
Hmm. Was it common to chain birds to these garden follies?
No. No, I think Dr. Brooks, who did that, was quite unusual. And he did so because these were all very exotic birds. His father had imported birds, as well as his brother, and other mammals and things from exotic places from a very long time ago. And insofar as he was an anatomist, he liked to display them, but when they died, then he would macerate them, which is a nice way of saying boil them up and keep the bones, and he would put them in his museum. He had this thing called the Museum Brooksianum, which was filled with thousands and thousands of specimens. And so they were actually, it's been compared to a sort of a living larder, as it were. But an extraordinary thing. And in fact, for a very long time, he had a gate that was more or less, as we call it, transparent. You could see through railings that so passers-by could actually observe these animals on this curious little bit of uh, Gibraltar re-erected in his garden. And it was only after a fire in a neighboring building in the Pantheon in the late 18th century when people were so horrified by these terrified animals who were chained to the rocks and couldn't get away
Oh.
that he was forced to put up sort of a much more solid barrier so people weren't troubled by such scenes afterwards. But the garden did survive until about 1830, at which time some of the best birds were given to the Zoological Gardens of London, and some went to that's the London Zoo, we now call London Zoo, and some went to the Surrey Zoological Gardens. So they were the ones that did manage to survive were given better homes.
Can you tell us how those volcanic eruptions were created?
Well, I don't know the exact mechanics, but I think they were largely done through creating fires, and the sound came from, I believe, cannons and rifle fire. So just like we do our solar lumiere now, but with obviously more primitive
Mm.
effects, but still, it was done obviously calculated to be done at times of darkness, and everything was kind of miniaturized. So it wasn't this enormous crater, but many people or some people may have heard of this wonderful volcano that was created in the gardens at Wörlitz in Germany in the late 18th century. It was a very similar arrangement there where you had these eruptions. And so again, it was something that had actually been done before, but this was done, whereas the one in Wörlitz was done for a private garden, this was done for a subscription garden in London. So again, people making money out of creating novelties.
Henrietta doesn't have a question as much as a statement.
Yes.
She says, how did papier-mâché survive in that climate?
Yes, good question. I think that lots of these things were burnt down very regularly, so they were replaced. I think that they had constantly to rebuild things because there were lots of these things. Many of the spectacles involved quite dramatic sort of acts like you did, burn places down. They burnt, for instance, in the taking of Gibraltar, they actually burnt miniature ships to show exactly what was happening there. And then they would reflect on the waters. It was all to intensify the spectacle. So I think that things did get replaced on a regular basis. But I suspect they were also painted. But you know, it was a time when almost everything was made in a very gimcrack way, especially garden scenery. So I'm sure that although it was probably, I call it papier-mâché, it probably had something a little bit more substantial, but it was intended always to be reasonably ephemeral.
Right. Pamela asks, is Russell Square still there?
Oh, Russell Square's still there, absolutely. And and that was in fact built on the site of the Duke of Bedford's garden. When I showed that large funnel that projected into the countryside from Bedford House, several garden squares, including Bedford, Woburn, Tavistock squares, were built within that garden. So when that land was given over, it was used still to create some gardens. And when Bedford Square was made, it was considered to be, or was the largest square in London. So large, in fact, that when Dickens, I think, was taken in there for the first time, and sort of almost, I think he was blindfolded. He was let in there, and then they took the blindfold off his eyes, and he couldn't believe he wasn't in open countryside because it was so extensive. He couldn't believe that he was in central London.
This is an interesting, more of a statement and a question, I guess. This person who is anonymous says that a few years ago they visited Strawberry Hill and learned from the docents that Horace Walpole used to paint the cows in the field in front of the house blue. And he wants to know, one, if this was true, and if so, why?
I, I'd never heard that, but
It sounds like Lord.
it's possible, but I've never heard that before. But there were interesting examples of cattle being used for picturesque effect in gardens. And for instance, we know that in France, the Duc de Ligneville created cardboard cutouts of cows that he put into his field to give a sense of perspective and distance, as it were, when you perceived his place. And obviously much easier to look after. So there were devices that were used in the 18th century purely for scenographic effect. So it's very possible he did something like that, but it's unknown to me. But we know also that, for instance, in the early 19th century, or from possibly late 18th century, that many breeds of cattle were kept deliberately very small. So when they were put in parks, that they made the landscape look significantly larger. Again, contributing to this perspectival effect that the landscapes were perceived as being very big.
It's interesting because it makes me think of Lord Berners and painting his were there doves that he painted? This
Yes.
would be in the 20th century, and it sounds like something that Horace Walpole would do. I've been to Strawberry Hill quite a few times, and I've never heard that. Doesn't mean it's not true. It does sound like something theatrical that he'd like, but very
Yes,
interesting.
he was fond of those sort of gestures, but it's quite possible, but I don't know where we've got the blue paint from.
Can you tell us what a subscription garden is?
Yeah, subscription gardens were gardens that were open to the paying public. So people were charged for admission, and they became quite popular in the early 19th century when people were looking for places of amusement. So you had them in spas, you had them in any number of, zoological, botanical gardens. There were lots of private botanical gardens that were opening up by subscription. So it just meant that you paid admission. And that money was hopefully reinvested, or usually was, by the owners to create further spectacles or more amusing things. It should be said too that lots of these things didn't last terribly long. They came in and out of fashion very quickly. So the Surrey Zoological Garden lasted for about 20 years, but then just everyone got tired of their entertainment, just as they got tired of Vauxhall and other places before that. These places have a reasonably short life because there are so many competing attractions and everyone's trying to outdo each other. So there's a rapid succession of ever more imaginative and inventive places to visit.
Tony asked the great question, what generally unknown slash hidden garden is open to the public that you consider a must-see?
Dear.
I know it's a
I
big.
think, well, among the more interesting gardens that seldom get seen and people don't really know about is in St. John's Lodge in Regent's Park. The park itself, everyone knows, is open to the public, but by St. John's Lodge, there's a very small garden that it is public has public access, and it's right beside the lodge itself, and it's the most beautiful and quiet sort of resort. And that is a pretty amazing place, right in the very heart of London, that most Londoners have never heard about. So that is a very delightful place. But again, I think sometimes just peering over the walls of some of these gardens is pretty amazing.
That's wonderful. I'd never heard of that garden, so that's lovely to hear. Do any of the great houses that line the Thames exist today?
No. All the great houses that were formerly episcopal palaces, or the great palaces in Strand, were pulled down. The last one was Northumberland House, which was pulled down in 1876. So, no, they were all, most of them had, or quite a few, I should say, had very early origins and were pretty ropey, even when they were turned into secular palaces in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were expanded and recast on the outside and done up. But I believe a lot of them were really uh, in extremis, as it were, when they were pulled down. And again, these were the major landowners who found it convenient to sell and beneficial to sell these places for redevelopment. So sadly, they were almost all gone. There are tiny fragments one can find, like walls and things like that, but almost everything has been erased. So sadly not. But you can still imagine when you walk down Strand what it must have been like. But now, of course, with the creation of the embankment, we don't appreciate the fact that the River Thames was earlier on a much wider river and much less tidal way, but it had more gentle banks and much more interesting in terms of all the gardens that lined its edge. And sadly, almost all gone.
The last question is from Anne, who says, can you talk briefly about the organizations with which you're associated in terms of their advocacy and their preservation? And she says she has your book, which is excellent.
Yes, well, that's very kind. So I've for almost 30 years worked with the historical palaces where I've been the gardens advisor, and our aim is to conserve and present and open to the public some of the greatest royal gardens in London, so including Hampton Court, Kew Palace Gardens, and Tower of London, Kensington Gardens. And we have among our initiatives, it's not only purely, as it were, sustaining these places and keeping them open for display, keeping them alive and interesting, but also now we're considering very carefully our sustainability and our responsibility to be to have greater biological diversity and to work with climate change. So we're very much up on those things. It's difficult, I must say, though, with historic gardens. It's a great philosophical question how one can present gardens from the past and still evoke the past and be responsive to the desires to think about present constraints and problems with gardens. So we're doing that, and then with the London Parks and Gardens Trust, where as it were, the County Gardens Trust this for the greater metropolis. So it's 160 square miles of area in the central of sort of Greater London, and we're interested in monitoring the health, as it were, and keeping an eye on garden spaces. And lots of these being not terribly grand. We most of these are being extraordinary spaces created over the last 800 years in London, and we keep a record of all these on this thing called London Gardens Online, which anyone can consult for free on the internet. And it you can look up any part of London and find the most arcane and wonderful gardens. Were you planning a trip to London, you could actually plan to see everything from sheep walks to 17th, 18th century cemeteries across town. So it's a really wonderful resource, and we try to educate the general public in the importance of maintaining urban gardens and the history of these places. And then I work with a number of other organizations and private landowners across the town that are similarly interested in preserving the importance, as it were, of green spaces in London, because we're now on the cusp of being considered almost like an urban forest in the whole of London, because we're so rich in gardens and trees. So it's really important that we try and educate people um, as to the importance of verdure and open space and ventilation, as it were, in these great cities.
As an American, it's just sort of hard to take in 800 years of garden history. It's really astonishing. I don't have a question for you, but we have a last minute comment that I think is very interesting and worth reading regarding the blue cows at Strawberry Hill. An anonymous attendee writes, might this be because Joshua Reynolds had a property across the river and had written a treatise against using the color blue? This is a connection that I thought possible given what we know about Walpole's personality, painting the cows blue in order to annoy Reynolds, which I think is very
Sounds a lovely
interesting.
idea.
Well, we know that Walpole could be very waspish, and it sounds like something he very much could have that vengeful streak in him. So I think that's very interesting indeed.
Yes, yes, it sounds absolutely. If he could have done it, he would have, that's for sure.
If he could have, he would have.
Yes.
Unfortunately, everybody, that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank Todd so very much. If you have any other questions, please contact us at heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and very much appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.